The night Moscow burned was not just a military moment, it was a message. A message delivered straight into the center of Russian power, shattering an assumption that held for 3 years of war, that of Russian capital were tapsage unesco doppelers humans exoptional. Ukraine demonstrated that it could reach DBUME territory with a level of precision powerful enough to shake the psychology of an interaced in session. But in modern warfare, the most dangerous consequences are not found in the strike itself. Telling what follows. And we step back, strip away emotion, and examine this eventually. Ukraine's action may have triggered a chain reaction. Ms. Dimension High's ultimate beneficiary is neither Kiev nor Washington. It may be Beijing. When Ukraine strikes Moscow, what does the one see? Some see bonus, some see Russian vulnerability. But strategic planners see something else entirely, the growing risks that the United States is being pulled to the bra into a war of attrition with no clear endpoint. For 3 years, Washington's core strategy has been consistent. Keep Ukraine alive, lead Russia, but avoid crossing thresholds that could force uncontrollable escalation. This restraint is not weakness, it is calculation. The United States understands a fundamental truth: prolonged wars are enemies of economic power. And the strike on Moscow may have destabilized that balance. When a capital city is attacked, political pressure shifts instantly. In Washington, the debate no longer revolves around whether aid is justified. It transforms into a more dangerous question: if Russia retaliates flexibly, how long can the United States remain on the sidelines? Every additional air defense system, every emergency funding package, every escalation into Russia's racist response translates into tens or hundreds of billions usage of just like burning in a conflict that is more in makes this knowing makes this turn formation for in Russian. This war is not Afghanistan. It is not Iraq. It is an industrial, technological, financial war of attrition. Money here does not just buy weapons. It buys time, attention, and strategic bandwidth. And the longer the conflict tracks on, the cost of the United States is not merely budgetary. It is a loss of opportunities elsewhere to millions far opportunities far more critical to long-term power. While Washington's focus is locked on Eastern Europe, another player is quickly benefiting from that distraction. China does not need to fight a single missile at Moscow. China does not need to issue dramatic statements. China simply needs to wait. Wait as cheap Russian oil continues to flow eastward. When Russia was cut off from Western markets, its energy did not disappear. It was redirected. And the largest, most reliable destination with the fewest questions asked was China. This steady influx of discounted energy does more than stabilize China's supply. It fundamentally lowers the cost structure of its entire economy. When energy is cheap, everything becomes cheaper. Transportation, manufacturing, industrial logistics. In a global economy increasingly defined by price competition, this is a left advantage. While American companies struggle with high energy costs, expensive supply chains, and elevated interest rates raised by inflationary pressure, these serves a melt rate than an entirely different environment. Cheap energy, massive scale, optimized logistics, and most importantly, freedom from triumphant entanglement in a war they are not fighting. Even the war in Ukraine continues. The United States spends more. Drags on as debt grows, internal political pressure intensifies, and strategic focus arose. Meanwhile, China leverages this very conflict to strengthen its competitive position in the global economy quietly, methodically definition. This is the central strategic paradox. On one hand, Ukraine strikes Moscow to prove that no place is safe. On the other, that variation increases escalation risk, potentially locking the United States into the war for longer, precisely the outcome America's primary competitive. War is not fought only on battlefields. It is fought on balance sheets, in logistics costs, and in the final price of goods sold on the global market. And from that perspective, China is playing a patient game, allowing Russia and the United States to adjust one another while affects pobiomits of Venetish. The real question is not whether Ukraine has the right to strike Moscow. The real question is this: Who pays the long-term price for these symbolic blows, and who profits from a prolonged war? In the next part, we will examine Sphinxy and more dangerous. Is Washington being drawn into a strategic trajectory that sees increasingly difficult to escape? And is China quickly turning this war into a factory for long-term advantage? Once a war crosses a psychological threshold, it stops behaving like a controlled conflict and starts behaving like a Kravachino field. Every decision made afterward becomes harder to reverse. Ukraine's strike on Moscow did exactly that. It transformed the war from a regional conflict managed arms length the EU strategic problem, the present problem demands directingly demands Deutschen. This is how great powers get chopped not by sudden catastrophes but by incremental commitments that feel unavoidable at the time. From Washington's perspective, walking away is not a clean option. If U.S. support weakens after Ukraine demonstrates such reach, the message to allies worldwide would be devastating. It would suggest that even when a part of Prague's cable mold in a link with Western objectives, support remains conditional and fragile. That perception alone can't reshape global alliances. So the logic becomes self-reinforcing. More escalation leads to more support. More support leads to deeper entanglement. And deeper entanglement reduces the ability to step back. This is the anatomy of a strategic sinkhole. Every new Russian response forces Washington to choose between restraint and credibility. If Russia retaliates harshly, the United States must reinforce Ukraine to prevent collapse. If Russia escalates slowly, Washington must still maintain pressure to avoid signaling weakness. In either scenario, American involvement expands not because I once do, but because the alternatives appear worse. This is not about emotion. It is about institutional momentum. Military planners argue that pulling back would waste previous investments. Political leaders fear the domestic backlash of losing Ukraine. Defense industries expand production lines that then require continued demand. Entire bureaucratic ecosystems form around sustaining the conflict. Once this machinery is in motion, stopping it becomes political and economical painful. And while this machinery grinds forward, it consumes something more valuable than money: strategic focus. The United States has finite attention, finite political capital, finite industrial capacity. Every missile ship east will not stop out elsewhere. Every intelligence asset focused on Russia is one not monitoring another theater. Every diplomatic heart spent managing escalation Eastern Europe is and how not spent shaping the Indo-Pacific balance. This is where the strategic picture widens. China does not need Ukraine to lose. China does not need Russia to win. China only needs the war to continue. As long as the conflict remains unresolved, the United States remains distracted. As long as Washington is tied down, Beijing gains room to maneuver economically, technologically, and geopolitically. Cheap energy is only the first layer of this advantage. The deeper layer is competitive asymmetry. American companies operate under conditions shaped by war-driven inflation, elevated interest rate, and supply chain stress. Capital becomes more expensive. Long-term investment becomes riskier. Margins tighten. Meanwhile, Chinese firms benefit from energy discounts, state-backed financing, and environment insulated from direct war costs. This is not accidental. It is structural. Why the United States spends hundreds of billions stabilizing a battlefield, China channels capital to manufacture tunis spattering, despischen specialistes, Avishitskafisization. One side burn resources to prevent loss. The other converts global instability into leverage. And this advantage compounds over time. Lower logistic costs allow Chinese exporters to undercut competitors. Lower energy costs stabilize domestic production during global volatility. Extended war keeps Western policymakers focused on immediate security crisis than long-term industrial competitiveness. In other words, the longer the war drags on, the more China benefits from a gap that keeps widening quietly in the background. This is why Ukraine's fragile one Moscow, while tactically impressive, creates strategic tension for its supporters. It raises the emotional stakes while narrowing strategic flexibility. It increases the probability of escalation while reducing Washington's ability to recalibrate. The United States now face a dilemma with no clean exits. If it pushes harder, it risks deeper financial and strategic exhaustion. If it pulls back, it risks credibility collapse. If it maintains the current course, it drives into a prolonged conflict. Host and state remains undefined. And all three paths converge on the same outcome: extended commitment. This is the core genre of symbolic escalation. It wins headlines, but it locks systems into trajectories that are difficult to alter. The word seems to be a tool of strategy and palms a condition that shapes strategy itself. Meanwhile, China watches patiently, not cheering, not condemning, just calculating. In the final part, we will confront the most uncomfortable question of all. Has the West misunderstood the nature of this war entirely? And is China exploiting the vast understanding to reshape the global balance of power without ever firing the shot? Terrace is a misconception in much of the Western debate about this war. It assumes that those who unify are passive observers, that influence only belongs to those firing missiles, those sending tanks. History shows the opposite. The most dangerous players are often the ones who stay outside the blast radius while shaping the conditions and method. China understands this better than anyone. Beijing does not need to control the battlefield in Ukraine. It only needs to control the consequences of the battlefield. And those consequences are now increasingly predictable. A prolonged war drains American resources. It locks Washington EU ISIS management mode. It accelerates debt accumulation. It raises political fatigue. And it delays strategic relocation toward Asia. From China's perspective, this is not chaos. It is structure. Every year this war continues, the United States' diverse industrial of part calculatory replenishment factories that could modernize infrastructure or strengthen domestic supply chains are instead producing citizens in systems that are zigged by war. That production does not generate long-term economic growth. It prevents loss, but it does not create advantage. China, meanwhile, does the opposite. It converts cheap energy into industrial momentum. It converts global instability into export dominance. It converts Western distraction into strategic space. This is not about ideology. It is about timing. China does not need to rush Taiwan. It does not need dramatic escalation. What it needs is a global environment in which Western economies are stretched, divided, and operating under constant pressure. A war where attention is fermented and decision-making is rigged rather than deliberate. A long war in Europe delivers exactly that. And here is the most uncomfortable truth. The longer the war drags on, the harder it becomes for the United States to pivot even way. Commitments accumulate. Expectations solidify. Political narratives harden. Eventually, the cost of disengagement appears higher than the cost of staying, even when staying produces no victory. This is how strategic inertia forms. Ukraine's strike on Moscow fits into this dynamic in a troubling way. It increases emotional investment. It intensifies symbolic confrontation. It sharpens the sense that this war must be seen to some undefined conclusion, but was driven by symbolism rather than achievable and state reliant clearly. Pay excess. And exhaustion favors the patient. China is not betting on Russia's strength. It is betting on Western fatigue. It is betting that democratic systems under prolonged stress will struggle to maintain coherence. It is betting that economic pressure, political polarization, and fiscal strain will gradually narrow Washington's strategic options. And so far, that bet is paying off. While the United States debates another aid package, Chinese factories expand capacity. While Western logistic costs remain elevated, Chinese porters lock in contracts. While American policymakers juggle multiple crises, China's planners execute long-term industrial strategy without interruption. This is asymmetric warfare without warfare. The final irony is this. Ukraine's courage and tactical brilliance may accelerate. A strategic outrage ultimately weakens its most powerful backer. Not because Ukraine is wrong to fight, but because great power competition does not reward emotion. It rewards endurance, structure, and control over systems larger than any single battlefield. Power in Ukraine is real. Their suffering is real. The stakes are real. But the global contest unfolding behind it is even larger. And in that contest, decisive fires, the fewest shot might end up reshaping the world the most. The question now is not whether Ukraine can strike Moscow. It is whether the United States can afford to remain locked in a war high's greatest beneficiary, maybe watching from afar, quietly, patiently, and profitably.